Since the rise of Mohammad bin Salman as the Saudi crown prince, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has tried to offer a rather attractive face of itself through making a number of cosmetic changes. Allowing women to drive for the first time in the history of the kingdom, opening cinemas across the country after decades, and hosting international sporting events are all part of a greater scheme developed by the Saudis in a bid to rebrand their country as a land modern and safe enough for foreign investors. But every now and then, the kingdom rears its ugly head, showing its real colors. The tragic death of Professor Musa Al-Qarni in Dhahban prison once again reminds the international community of the kingdom's grave human rights record. Shortly after the death of Al-Qarni, the Saudi rights group Al-Quds tweeted, "Qarni was subjected to brutal torture, and the Saudi authorities deliberately harmed him by giving him unsuitable medication."
Fortunately, that's not a rarity at all. And to the contrary, for dissenters to go against the KSA and end up dying in custody while undergoing such inhumane treatment and detention is actually something that happens very frequently. If they don't end up meeting their fate by other means, whether it's capital punishment or even being, as we all saw, assassinated while visiting a Saudi embassy in a foreign country. We've seen in recent years frequently the way the regime has treated women's rights activists and other, political prisoners.
This is just the latest example of slow killing of prisoners of conscience Riyadh has long been accused of. Blaming the Saudi authorities for violating the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, Sanad organization has accused them of following the method of media concealment about the conditions of prisoners of conscience inside the cells of injustice to make their file more complex, amid growing concern over their fate.
Oh, well, just earlier this year, there was another case of some Saudi humanitarian aid worker. I believe he worked for Red Crescent, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and then another 20 years he's forbidden to travel. Even if he survives his sentence and get out, he won't even be able to leave the country. And they tortured him by electrocuting him and flogging him until he signed a false confession admitting to the bogus charges. And that's just one of many examples. So cases like this are the rule, not the exception, where jailing of activists, murder of dissidents, repression of women and journalists, and anyone who peacefully dissents, that's the norm in Riyadh.
Musa Al-Qarni was born in 1954 in the Jazan region, Saudi Arabia. He obtained his PhD in jurisprudence at Al-Qura University. In 2007, he was arrested and a few years later, in 2011, was sentenced to 15 years in prison, followed by a 20-year travel ban. Among the charges leveled against Al-Qarni were disobeying the king, planning to establish a party, communicating with foreign bodies, attempting to create chaos, and money laundering. Al-Qarni was a member of a group of rights activists who later came to be known as the Jeddah Reformers. The leader of the group, Saud al-Hashimi, received a 30-year prison sentence with a further 30-year travel ban, as well as a fine of 2 million riyals. Saudi Arabia is known across the world as one of the worst rights abusers, where rights advocates are detained and where peaceful activism is treated like an act of terrorism. Mohammad bin Salman's promises of reform soon turn out to be empty, while the macabre murder of Jamal Khashoggi put out the last faint flickers of hope.
We're talking about one of the most oppressive regimes in the world and biggest violators of human rights, not only against other countries like Yemen and Bahrain, but domestically against their own population. Most famously, as we've seen in the case of the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, even when dissidents have been living in self-imposed exile while working for, a flagship Western newspaper, they've made clear that speaking out against the royal family is not tolerated by the House of Saud, which will take, and they're willing to take any and all measures to silence those who would dare defy them.
Among other prominent reformists serving time are Sunni scholars such as Salman al-Ouda, Ali al-Omari, and Awad al-Qarni, not to mention Prince Ahmed bin Abdulaziz, bin Salman's own uncle.
And, it doesn't stop there. Even if you're somebody who's wealthy and powerful, bin Salman placed his own cousin, for example, Princess Basma, if I'm saying that right, in prison, just for the crime of advocating women's rights and criticizing the divorce laws. And, she too was held in conditions where on social media, there was posts that were deleted that said her health was deteriorating. So if they don't outright assassinate you, they engage in slow motion assassination, like the case of this cleric where, they detain political prisoners and keep them in conditions so dire and neglect their health. If they don't outright execute you, you'll be killed in slow motion and held in such conditions where their health deteriorates.
By many credible accounts, the deceased academic was exposed to physical and psychological torture for 12 years, and following a deliberate health negligence, he suffered a brain stroke that resulted in his death. On October 19, prisoners of conscience tweeted, "Confirmed to us that the cause of Sheikh Musa Al-Qarni's death was that he was beaten in the head and face by extremist prisoners as the prison administration placed him with them and refused to transfer him with the elderly." The Saudi authorities reportedly refused to hand over Al-Qarni's body to his family, and he was buried in Al-Baghi in the absence of his family and friends. During his time in prison, Al-Qarni was reportedly held incommunicado. His family was never allowed to visit him when he was behind bars.
You look at the creation of the Saudi state, which was essentially, if you look at the way it was formed and the way that its territorial expansion occurred, which was to serve the interests ultimately as a proxy for British imperialism, and then that's continued with America's full spectrum dominance, the purpose that Saudi Arabia serves, I don't see any change in leadership coming to the kingdom. And as long as the House of Saud is in power, there's definitely not going to be anything other than these kind of really cosmetic reforms that are mainly, to do things like open the country up to more foreign investment or increase tourism. There's nothing. There's certainly not going to be significant political reforms or any kind of transition to democracy as long as the House of Saud is in power. That's for sure.
To diversify its oil-based economy, the Saudi kingdom has formulated Vision 2030 and spent bags of money on PR exercises. But before anything else, the international community should urge the kingdom to take serious steps in improving human rights and lay it down as a precondition to any future financial interactions.